In this episode, our friend Wayne Jett is back with us, and we're continuing to discuss his book, The Fruits of Graft. We're going right through the Great Depression and right up to about World War II. Thanks for listening. All right, welcome to the Banking with Life podcast. I'm your host, James Neathery. We have our friend Wayne Jett on with us again today as a continuation of the episodes that we've done. We've done two. This is the third episode in a kind of telling the story prior to the Great Depression, leading right up to the Great Depression, and hopefully we'll be able to go past the Great Depression. Maybe not in this episode. And I'm happy, and I appreciate you, Wayne, for taking your time and making this happen, even participating here. And I think that our last episode, we're really coming up to about 1901. Is about where we left off. And so if we continue from there going into the Great Depression, that's what I'm thinking.
All right. Thank you very much, James, and nice to be back with you. I love talking about this subject. It's not pleasant at many times, but nevertheless, I do so in order to, it really is for the purpose. Yes, it's important that we understand what happened back then so that we judge fairly the efforts of our ancestors and understand better what they experienced and why their lives turned out the way they did. We talked about the 1901 plan already, and it's really outrageously harmful intentions toward the people, toward the working people, anyone capable of supporting himself and his family. That's the middle class. Not just people with middle income, but of high income if they earn it, if they work for it. Low income, even if they're in the poor area, they're middle class if they're supporting themselves. Just so they're not slaves, servants on the handout for somebody else. Everyone else is middle class. Important to recognize because those are the people of common interest that, in effect, are of the view that you do the best you can and you can do better and keep improving your families and your outlook. So let's look at what happened as we get on 1913. Two very bad things happened, both of them breaches of the promises made on the campaign trail by the candidate Woodrow Wilson, president of Princeton University, by the way. That was his academic standing and his basis for getting into politics. President of a major premier so-called highly reputable academic institution. But as soon as he got into office, he broke two important promises. He had promised not to sign a tax on earned income being the hallmark of the middle class. You earn income by working for it. He said he wouldn't agree to an income tax, and not only did he agree to one, it was a progressive income tax with different rates for different earning levels. And he signed that into law right at the end of 1913. The other thing that he had promised is no central bank owned by the rich, the elite, what we call today the global cabal. And he signed that too. That was the Federal Reserve, misnamed in order to mislead people, to make them think that it's a part of the federal government. It never has been. It never will be. And yet so many people, educated people, absolutely insist still today that the Federal Reserve is an agency of the federal government and very much aligned with the well-being of ordinary people and our government representatives and so forth. It is effectively a Rothschild bank. All of its financial operations are really run by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is owned and controlled by the Wall Street banks. They are the majority stockholders. Even among the majority stockholders, is the Rothschild family that has control of the Federal Reserve, and it operates without being audited ever. It runs its own operations. They are secret. We know what they do. They put out a bunch of data. We have no way of knowing whether it's accurate or inaccurate. And of course, even in these recent days and months, here we are in 2020, they are appearing to be in the last phases of this fiat currency. They are putting out truckloads full of currency. That's not even adequate to describe what's being done right now, but we won't go into that. But that's what he did. He was, Wilson was, even though the cloth coat candidate, he was a willing accomplice of the global elite. Perhaps he had better intentions. He said that he did. He said he regretted his actions in doing those things, but he did them. He also got us into World War I, put American men over to be slaughtered along with the European men, all a plot of the global elite to destroy as many males as possible of the middle class, so forth and so on.
I must, if I can interject here, Wayne, additionally in 2013, I believe it was the 17th Amendment, where prior to 2013 or 1913, the senators, the Congressional House, the senators were appointed by the state houses. Right?
Yes.
And so that changed. I think it's the 17th Amendment that now senators became elected, on a national scale. So it's a broad. They became whatever you call it. They just run for office on a national level.
Well, yes, they do. They run for office actually on the state level. The senators.
They're elected.
But they're elected directly by the people of the state, statewide, as opposed to having to answer to the political people, the legislature of the state that has to pay the bills for the state and look out after the state's interests and so forth.
So that further consolidated power in Washington, diminishing the power from the states and transferring that power to the national federal government. So,
in large part, it made those state the U.S. senators subject to complete control and influence by the central money powers. The Wall Street people could buy every senator, as opposed to having senators watched closely by their state legislatures. And if they got to looking after other interests or things that hurt the state, then their reins could be pulled in and they could be replaced by the state legislatures. So yes, that is another important aspect of things.
I would also like to say that you cannot have a world war without a central bank. And so it was within 6 or 8 months of creating the Federal Reserve, a central bank, that World War I began. I mean, what timing? It's like, it's just, what a coinkydink.
Yes, and certainly it fit in with the 1901 plan that we talked about last time. It was the plan overall, not to repeat what I've already said, but it was the plan to destroy the middle class completely and also to reduce human population sharply to get to the point by the year 2000 that they could poison all of the people they didn't want. They need to develop the technology and the capability for doing that in a controlled way so that the people couldn't get out of hand and discover them and fight back and so forth. Yes, that was a part of the plan. And if you put the entire 20th century into that context, then so many events turn out to be extremely reflective of that 1901's plan to destroy the middle class and to go back to a two-class system comprised only of the global elite and their servants, their slaves.
So we shouldn't look around at what's going on, what has been going on in our lifetimes and the lifetimes of our parents and even our grandparents, and be overly shocked.
Right. And we could tie it right into what's happening today in the cities of our country and who's doing it. It's very much in that vein. The primary difference, I'll just get to this and then we'll go back to the earlier part of the 20th century. But the events we're experiencing today, all the so-called controversy, in my humble opinion, we have a president for the first time who is actually capable and has the backing of our military and a substantial part of our executive branch in order to be able to actually fight these people instead of being completely their servants and carrying out their policies and their goals of exterminating really the central population of the United States.
Praise God.
And not only the United States, other countries as well. You can see that what is happening in the United States now is largely reflective of the same thing that's been happening in the last 10 to 20 years in Europe. We got lots of news of all of the immigrants from the Middle East wars going into Europe, and they're so-called taking them in the European Union, even though the people there were strongly objecting to it. Well, the difference between Europe, the European Union, and the United States during that same period of time is that our newspapers were not reporting what was being done in our country, and the same kind of importing of those people from the war-torn countries into the United States was going on in grand scale, night flights to various cities in the United States of untold numbers of people who were not ordinary immigrants. They were people being imported in order to greatly change the landscape, political landscape, and political views of people living within the United States. Okay, so let's go back and talk about where we were as we wound up on World War I with the great killings of so many hundreds of thousands, actually millions of soldiers in the worst circumstances, weeding out the young men of reproductive age, keeping them away from their wives and children, destroying them by the millions, and yet even that awful thing, which I detail in the numbers, they're just absolutely staggering in the Fruits of Graft. That was disappointing to the ruling elite. They viewed it as somewhat of a failure and an experience that's saying we just can't get rid of enough humans this way. We have to find a more efficient way of doing it. But nevertheless, we come back from 1918, the close of the war. We have the influenza that kills tens of millions more people around the world, including more people in America than we lost in all of our wars put together. All of it done quite certainly by a laboratory prepared virus or whatever it was that killed very astonishingly. It didn't kill the old so much. It killed people in the prime of their lives, young, virile people, childbearing age, and it did so within 2, 3, 4 days of their contracting this thing. And so that is the kind of circumstance that we came to at the end of the 1920s. And we did so in a circumstance in which the income tax had been increased during the war. Mm-hmm. the war was winding down, and the country was trying to get back to work. But they did so in a circumstance in which they declared the value of the dollar after the war was over. They declared it to go back to the same valuation that it had at the beginning of the war. And during the war, the dollar had been devalued quite a lot, maybe as much as, sharply, I would say maybe as much as 50%. That's quite a lot. I would say probably more in the nature of perhaps 25%. That was done. That happened because there was an embargo on shipments of gold out of the country, and so the dollar's value had dropped during that period of time. In other words, we had some inflation during the war, and so coming out in the 1920s. Wilson got ridden out of town on a rail. Practically, the Republicans won in 1920 by going back to normalcy. That was understood as a campaign promise of the Republicans to cut taxes, the income tax rates, back to where they were before the war. But by going back to the dollar's value before the war, $20.67 an ounce of gold, it meant we had a short deflation right when the Republicans got into office. And so we had a deflation that caused a sharp recession, but it lasted only about a year, a little more. The Republican president, his name is escaping me right this second, but he died suddenly in his second year in office on a train trip, and probably from an assassination. But I don't think the historical records are clear enough, at least not to me, to know for certain. But when he died, his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, from one of the New England states, became president. And lo and behold, even though he is derided today as being silent Cal, the do-nothing president, he was probably the most supply side, in other words, classical economics president that we had in the 20th century. He gave, I think, the best speech I've seen given by a politician, certainly by a president, on economic policy to the New York Stock Exchange Club or something of that sort in about 1923. And essentially it was supply side economics, as they called it during the Reagan years, personified. In other words, he made the pitch that we can have greater economic growth if we reduce taxes. And if we can cut taxes, we'll have economic growth, we'll start growing, and we'll grow even faster and faster as we go, making tax cuts as we go. He wanted a larger tax cut immediately, but Congress wouldn't agree to it. Even the Republicans didn't give him enough help in the House and Senate. So he was able to negotiate a minor tax cut, but at least a tax cut in the first year. What he did is he didn't go wild with spending, and he produced a surplus in the Treasury budget in the first year. And instead of spending that money as a surplus to so-called stimulate the economy the way the Keynesians insist we must do, he plowed it back into more tax cuts. They cut taxes every year he was in office after that. And he had a budget surplus every year. And we had the boom that developed in the 1920s, including the stock market boom based upon that economic performance. He had high employment, increasing prosperity. It was classical economic theory personified. And he comes to 1928 as the most popular president in a long time, if not in history, and bound to be reelected in a landslide. but so-called he chose not to run. Now, why would that be? It might be because his son, still I think in his teenage years, was at the White House played tennis, and dropped dead in the White House shortly thereafter of an unexplained reason. So we don't know whether that was a hit, but nevertheless, whatever it was, President Coolidge decided he would not run again. And even though his party had tried right up to almost the bitter end to get him to run, he still declined to do it. And the man who was elected instead, Herbert Hoover, I might tell you that he was described by President. Well, let me back up just a second. Before he's described by President Coolidge, I'll tell you that Hoover had been a world-class engineer, become wealthy that way, supposedly. And then he was put in charge by Wilson of the relief effort to Europe toward the ends of the war. He became very popular politically, and he was highly thought of in the public. But as of 1920, he was trying to run on the Democrat ticket with Franklin Roosevelt. So he's not the so-called rock-ribbed Republican conservative that everyone seems to think of him as today. He was by no means that. He was a Mr. Fix-It. In fact, President Coolidge had described him long toward 1928 or close to it, had described him as a man who's given, he by the way, got a position as Secretary of Commerce in the Coolidge administration, and was in that position all during the 20s. And Coolidge later described him as he's been a man who's given me unsolicited advice for the last 6 or 8 years, all of it bad. And yet,
there's a whole history on Herbert Hoover that most people don't know or not aware of, the Belgian Relief Fund, and he made tons of money. I consider him just an absolute water boy for the elite. But and yet he comes into office. His popularity was such that people thought he was the best equipped president elect ever. And he comes into office, and he immediately starts getting rolled by the Democratic opposition and allows himself to be, when he had no reason to do it. He actually had, I think, Republican majorities, at least to start with, in 1929. And yet the Congress comes together and they start this thing on the tariffs. He had plenty of votes that he could have stopped the tariffs with just a word. He never opened his mouth about it to really oppose it effectively until it was too late. And even then, when it was passed, it passed by only 3 votes. And he could have changed that many with just asking a couple of Republicans to change their votes. He could certainly have stopped it by a veto, and he didn't. So he was carrying the water for the ruling elite. And he signed that Smoot-Hawley tariff bill, of course, after the crash of 1929. He signed it in June of 1930. And within a year and a half, in other words, the end of 31, we had over 30% unemployment. We had dropped in both imports and exports by about 69% each, 69-70%. So it was an absolute disaster in terms of policy. And yet he did nothing to... he could have easily reversed it or something of the sort when it turned out to be such a mess. He did nothing about the fraud on Wall Street. The fraud on Wall Street is what today is called naked short selling. It was a planned crash in 1929. It was widely believed to have been done by stock manipulation and basically selling fake shares.
They called it watering the stock then. But the operators on Wall Street would sell stock they didn't own in millions of shares and drive the stock down to nothing, frightening people and panicking the market. And then they would buy it back the next day at the very low prices, make millions faster than they possibly could in any kind of economic growth. That's why Wall Street loves a crash. They make their millions and billions much faster in a crash than they do during prosperity and a general slow rise in the economy. So that's what we were experiencing then. Hoover did nothing about either of those things. And so by the end of 31, as I said, we had very high unemployment, no trade internationally, no ability to sell abroad, and we're buying nothing either. Factories were being liquidated. People were afraid to invest in new businesses. And so they were buying gold to try to protect the purchasing power, because Roosevelt was leaking that he would devalue the dollar. And so that was the circumstance going into 32 in the campaign. And what did Hoover propose as his campaign theme for going into 32? He proposed we've got to raise taxes in order to balance the budget. So the Democrats had taken over the House in 1930 in a sweeping turnaround. And so in 1930, in 31, they quadruple and increase the coverage of the number of people in the lowest bracket, and they triple the highest bracket. So the lowest bracket went from 1% and included a lot more income, lower level income, and it went to 4%. The top bracket, Hoover had gotten, Coolidge had gotten down to a maximum of 25% from a much higher rate during World War I. And so in 32, the top rate went to almost 75%, triple. And that had to be paid retroactively with no withholding taxes, all of it due on March 15th, which is exactly when we had the run on the banks. That is the so-called run on the banks and the loss of faith in the banks, in large part simply reflected people taking their money out of the banks to pay all of this income tax that Hoover had so brilliantly come up with as his platform for getting reelected. And of course, he was ridden out of town on a rail, politically speaking, losing in a landslide to Franklin Roosevelt. Although Roosevelt was speaking out of both sides of his mouth, Roosevelt gave speeches to the elite, both at the Union Club in San Francisco and in New York, telling them that, in effect, between you and me, our economy had grown much too large. We will never be able to employ the kind of people we've employed in the past. We must downsize to the kind of economy that works best for our country. And so, therefore, there will be stringent actions taken in order to correct this. That's not what he was telling the people. He was supposedly the man of the people out on the train whistle stops. And at the same time, he was speaking out of both sides of his mouth. So he comes into office and then starts his first of 4 terms, although the last one was shortened on the Roosevelt's part, and Truman took over for the last part of the 4th term. But let's talk about what was done in the first 2 terms. It was absolutely remarkable beginning in March of 33, the actions taken could not have been more cunning and destructive in terms of greatly worsening the economic position of the people in the country. And I want to be sure and try to just summarize these things. I could take a full hour on describing them, but I'll hit the first one in particular. Well, first, he was elected to undo those three things that Hoover had done. He did the reverse on each one of them. On the stock fraud that caused the crash, it was still going on and was still ripping off people off in the stock exchange. The naked short selling, as it's called today, the selling fake stock. Instead of doing something to actually make that a crime, first they passed a bill in 33 that made stock fraud a crime, but it had no penalty and it didn't define what it was. So in 34, they came back and did the Stock Exchange Act to supposedly govern the exchanges. And they set up the Securities and Exchange Commission as the exclusive regulator and policeman of the stock exchanges and stock trading. And who did he put in charge of the SEC as his first chairman? None other than the biggest, believed to be the biggest swindler on Wall Street during the crash, and certainly during much of the 20s, Joseph P. Kennedy. He was there at the SEC just long enough to hire its permanent staff, get those people in office, and then replace himself so he could go on with his money-making ways, and also on Roosevelt's right hand, and whispering in his ear as the years went on. That was what he did in terms of the stock fraud. On taxes, rather than cutting back taxes, as he had indicated he would, back to where they were under Coolidge, he raised and or added new taxes every year he was in office, except for 1 year, 1939. He did not raise them that year only because his request for increases and added new taxes was turned down by his Democrat-led House of Representatives because they had lost 83 seats in the 1938 elections, because by then the American people were calling it Roosevelt's Depression. That's the fact of the matter. And he insisted all year long that he would not sign a tax cut. And in fact, he didn't sign a tax cut, even though the House and the Senate passed it. It was a meager tax cut, but it became law only because he didn't veto it. He let it become law without his signature. His hallmark was higher taxes, more taxes, more taxes. So a complete double cross of the people who had put him in office expecting a tax cut. That was one of the policies that he followed. But let me get to what I think is the overriding symbol of, I could talk about the tariffs. Yes, tariffs has shut down world trade, and it was a substantial factor. And he appointed a Secretary of State who was strongly in favor of cutting the tariffs, Cordell Hull. Cordell Hull, immediately upon his appointment, organized a world conference in London to negotiate reduced tariffs. And at the brink of time in the summer of 1933, they were ready to sign the deals cutting tariffs back to allowing trade again. And Roosevelt himself did a radio speech from Washington declaring that he would never agree to fix the value of the dollar relating to gold. That is, he would not agree not to devalue the dollar. And everyone in international trade at that time knew and well understood that if you devalue your currency, it's just like raising tariffs. It allows you to have a selling advantage against your trading partners or competitors, and therefore it made any agreement on tariffs meaningless. And so, in effect, as the newspaper headline bannered the next day, FDR torpedoed the tariff negotiations, and so the lock on tariffs stayed in place, and everybody went away mad at the United States for what he had done to those negotiations. And so that's where he double-crossed there. So tariffs, taxes, fraud on the stock markets, he did everything exactly the opposite of what he had indicated in this campaign. And now let's see what else he did. Immediately, as soon as he got into office, he ordered that gold be surrendered to the U.S. Treasury for $20.67 an ounce. So all of the savings that the manufacturers and so forth who had to liquidate had put into gold, and it had it in there for a year or two. They had to turn in that gold for the same thing they paid for it, $20.67 an ounce. They made nothing on it. He got all the gold in by the end of the year, and on January 31st of 34, so a month after he got the gold in, he devalued the dollar by about, round numbers, 40%. And all of that profit, which would have been about a close to 70% profit for the people who had the gold if he had devalued the dollar before he confiscated it. No, the people in the country didn't get it. The people who had had their savings in it to try to save it from devaluation didn't get a dime. It all went into the federal government, and more specifically, all of those billions of dollars that he collected in that devaluation went into a secret fund called the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which was set up secretly with powers of complete control over that money and complete control over its own activities, and made exempt from all federal laws passed by Congress. It's still that way today, to the best of my understanding, and it's a very powerful secret force, very much of the nature that the Vatican and the City of London is a part of the apparatus of the global elite. So that was the matter of the way gold was taken out of the economy, and the dollar, in effect, was really made a fiat currency at that time, because even though the so-called gold standard was kept with regard to other countries, it meant the central banks of other countries, which were all owned by the global cabal, the Rothschilds primarily, and other major families of that nature. So the only ones able to buy gold from the Treasury were those other central banks. They were able to buy the dollar, buy gold for $35 an ounce all the way up to 1972. But Americans could not. And of course, by 1972, all of those central banks had bought all the gold from that had been bought by Roosevelt. I'm about to tell you what he did. But what he did to really make the Depression happen is that he immediately started buying gold on foreign exchange with tax money and with mortgage money or bond money, selling bonds into the U.S. capitalists and getting money for the government and putting it directly into gold, and taking that gold and sequestering it in the Treasury and prohibiting it from being monetized, as had been required by the gold standard, that if you have gold the government is responsible for monetizing it so its people will have the money reflected by its gold to spend so they can be more prosperous. But instead of doing that, he sucked all the money out of the American economy. He did so effectively that the purchasing power or the prices of goods and services had effectively fell to between 2 and 5 cents per dollar by the end of the 30s. That is the severe level of deflation that he created by taking dollars out of the economy, leaving so many fewer dollars in the U.S. economy for people to work for and to earn. That's what crashed the prices. That's what starved people to death by the millions during the 1930s. And on that point, the best two social studies that I've seen, social sciences, one done by a Russian, one done by a German. I think the German social scientists concluded that about 3 million at least had died of starvation in the United States. The Russian study concluded 6 million had died by starvation. I suspect it's much more. There were many more things that were not reported, did not get on the rolls, so forth and so on. And certainly the people of America did not take pride in the fact of announcing themselves to be starving or that they were dying of starvation. Many would not have been picked up and reported as anything other than people died, unknown causes or something of the sort. But in any event, those were the circumstances that were created. I could go into the various social programs that were so-called window dressing, but that's all they were. During those first 8 years of Roosevelt's presidency, that would be 1933 through 1940, he bought a total of 13,185.3 metric tons of gold on foreign exchange. That's how much he took out of the U.S. economy's money supply. Taking it out, so there could be nothing other than a tremendously sharp, hard, cruel depression. Destruction of food to so-called get prices up, when he knew what he was doing was taking money out of the economy. In 1937, for example, early in 37, he got news from somebody. Someone tipped him off from the ruling elite that the Treasury had received $7 billion in gold on foreign exchange from the European countries primarily. It appears to me that was because war was coming and people were selling out their factories in Europe, taking the money, converting them to dollars, and that basically caused gold to come in. And Roosevelt contacted his Treasury Secretary, Morgenthau, and told him that this was hot money coming in, and action had to be taken to make sure that it did not disrupt our economy, and it had to be restricted from being monetized. The gold coming into the Treasury and the gold standard requiring it to be monetized, Roosevelt was saying, no, we cannot do that. It would hurt our economy in the long run. Morgenthau's diary indicates he didn't agree with that, but he talked with the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve chairman, appointed by Roosevelt, didn't agree with it either, said it wouldn't be a good idea. In fact, he wound up arguing for some weeks and then writing a strong letter saying, no, this would be bad for the economy. We need to have the monetization and so forth. But Roosevelt convened a meeting brought the head of the Fed and his Morgenthau, the Treasury Secretary, in, and basically buttonholed them. And of course, the Fed rolled over, agreed, as I'm sure they were all on the same page anyway. Morgenthau says he wasn't, that he was for monetization, but nevertheless, it wound up that they did not monetize that $7 billion in gold, which would have been a tremendous shot. It doesn't sound like much today. That was a very large shot in the arm if they had monetized it back then. But not only did they not monetize that, Morgenthau reported in his diary that once they had written the regulations, they demonetized not only the gold that came in from Europe, they demonetized gold that the Treasury had bought from U.S. mines. So there was absolutely no excuse whatsoever not to monetize domestically produced gold, but nevertheless they did it to make certain no money got into the economy so that prices would rise and his ruling elite people could not buy oil, properties, and real estate and buildings and homes and so forth and so on at this completely destroyed pricing level that was created deliberately by Franklin Roosevelt and his global cabal. So that's the circumstance of how they. That's only the tip of the iceberg, though. There were other actions taken through the Fed, for example, to increase the bank reserves. As soon as appointees of Roosevelt had control of the Federal Reserve, they were given control of the bank regulation, and their first board meeting, they increased reserve requirements of regular banks, even though the banks weren't in trouble by then. At that point, they increased their reserve requirements by 50%. And that required loans to be foreclosed on homes and on farms, especially by small banks. And even if you were paying your loans on time, you're getting foreclosed. People sold out and selling their farms and homes for nothing to the big ag conglomerates that we've now seen producing our food with the kind of health problems that has resulted in over the years. In any event, that is a kind of a thumbnail about the kinds of things that went on, but certainly all that we've experienced in this so-called stock market reform, it was all a fake. The fraud continued all the way through. It still is. The SEC has been absolutely praised for being such a stellar law enforcement agency, as the FBI has been. And yet it is so shameful to see the kinds of things that have been actually done by those agencies that are simply blatant big lies in terms of the malfeasance in office of the people occupying those agencies. I can go into that if you want me to at this point, but
you can if you like. I must say, Wayne, that I had no idea how many Americans were purposely starved to death. No idea. I had no understanding of the demonetization of the gold, the sterilization of the gold, sterilizing the gold, taking it out of the economy. And I agree that it's just a thumbnail. What we're covering here in your book goes into extraordinary detail on the intent, the purpose, the method, the methods that were used to really destroy the middle class and the economy. I mean, it's just whole.
I might say that just within the last year or two, I can't remember the exact date, but there was a headline on Zero Hedge one day that's saying that central banks of the world are buying gold as if there's going to be a nuclear bomb dropping tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And I looked into the numbers that they were depending upon to say that. And the numbers, the tonnage of gold being bought by all central banks in the world combined in the last year or two is minuscule in comparison to the yearly purchases of Roosevelt between 1933 and 1940. They don't even stack up in terms of, in other words, during those years in which he was starving people to death, he was buying more gold than all central banks in the world in 2018 were buying combined, and doing it out of money coming directly out of the U.S. economy by his hand. Now, please take that into consideration when you understand that neither our academic institutions, nor our newspapers, nor our television stations, nor even our politicians is saying this anywhere in America today. And yet it is the fact. We are still being told blatant lies by the controlling powers in our country. And I believe that is exactly the reason why we have to be enlightened about them, so that we can understand what is going on presently, the attacks on our president and the attacks on trying to get our government back into influence and control by the people themselves before they actually destroy us, as was on their timeline for the 2016 election, if it hadn't gone the wrong way for them. So that is, I'll pause and let you redirect the conversation any way you'd like, James.
I appreciate that, Wayne. I mean, that's very powerful, and I'm okay to, get to a stopping point in this episode. I mean, that's extremely powerful. We're almost an hour into it, so.
Oh, goodness. I didn't realize we'd gone so long, or I had gone so long. I must apologize for that. But in any event,
not necessary.
We can get on to other things. I wasn't quite sure whether I had already covered this in our previous two talks, but I certainly am not reluctant to get into these ins and outs, because they are so pivotal in our understanding what has gone on since then. These things did not stop with Franklin Roosevelt's death. We have had repeated experiences all the way through with the subsequent presidents, either being rolled or being complete puppets of the same kind of global cabal. And it's done devastating things. My book covers the tech crash in detail as to how it was done. Of course, it covers the 29 crash, which was, by the way, described in 1938 by an operative of the ruling elite as the crash was defined in 1929, October 29, as the most important event of the revolution of the 20th century. The real revolution, he said. And that would have been another way of saying this was more revolutionary than the murder of the Tsar in Russia. Mm-hmm. I think the Russian Tsar was kidnapped and murdered because he refused to give the Rothschilds a central bank there. And so they invaded that country with the so-called Bolsheviks, which have an awful lot in common, I think, with the so-called Antifa people trying to make an invasion of the United States in the year 2020. It is very important that we inform ourselves about the truth of these matters in the past so we can be better advised and informed about our current dilemmas right now. And all I can say is that I'm so pleased that at least we are led by someone on our side, despite the fact that the deep state has a tremendous effort, a desperate effort underway right now to get back into power so they can make their death strokes as they had planned. And therefore, we must do all we can to make sure it doesn't happen. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you for sharing with us. This is very powerful. If I could, in this, we can cut this out. I have a question. In your opinion, do you think the cabal, the deep state, the powers that be, you can't really look, I've learned that you can't look at history and not consider that for the things that have happened by construct on purpose, somebody has to hate you, like the middle class. These things can't happen out of love, out of benevolence. I mean, they're constructed, and it comes from a dark place, in my opinion. Okay.
Well,
all right. So if, it just seems to me, and I understand the deep state, the cabal, they're behind, they're 20 years behind. I can completely get that and understand that. I mean, they have an agenda, and they've relentlessly worked to fulfill their agenda for the last century and even beyond. And so here's my question. It seems like, here's my observation, it seems like in the last few years they have ratcheted up their agenda to fulfill their agendas. And then, President Trump is in there, and I think that he's doing a lot of that maybe we can't see. I think there's a lot of prevention. The deep state would have made greater advances had the 2016 election gone the other way. And so I'm finally going to get to my question. Do you think the deep state believes or sees that they're in a death throw? They've got to really ratchet it up to make their advances on their agenda. Do they, and not that you can be a spokesman for the deep state. I guess, Wayne, I'm looking for clarity or your opinion on.
Well, I think I get the point of your question, and I think I would actually have to disagree. If the 2016 election had gone the other way, I don't think they were planning to, take it out over, say, the next few decades and take it easy on us. To the contrary, it appeared to me all the signs were that they were ready to make the death blows. The things that were being done during the previous 8 years and the 8 years before that and the 8 years before that, they were ready. The coffins had been bought. The hollow-nosed bullets had been bought by an agency of our government. And the agency had recruited to have people in place and were ready to go. And all of those things are not done, with benevolence in mind. So I called the other candidate in 2016 the closer, because I wouldn't be surprised if her mindset had not been that she wanted to be the one that at least was in charge when the activists on her opposition were deposed, when any ability whatsoever was destroyed for us to be able to actually mount a counterattack. And that is what I think is been going on for the last 3 years. we were trying to get to the point of actually mounting a counterattack. I think the counterattack has been mounted and is underway. They have certainly, on the surface, appeared to have blunted it. And it's not possible for me to say with any certainty how far the counterattack has gone. I'm inclined to think that it's succeeded much more than is yet publicly apparent. But we'll have to see the proof of the pudding in order to be able to talk about that.
That's fair. Very fair. All right. Very good. Do you have any other comments for this episode?
I think that's all, but I certainly would say that my opinion, my ability to express this information is much exceeded by what I was able to do in writing my book, The Fruits of Graft. I'd certainly recommend for purchase. It's easier for me to read than it is to hear and remember. And I think that may be true of others as well. But for posterity, whether you learn it or not, your children and their children need this information. And you ought to consider getting the information while it is available. $25 is what it's still selling for, even including shipping. And it's a hardbound book with a real string binding. String sewn binding, and so it's built to last. So get it while they're hot, as they say. And I thank you for your attention to this subject.
Thank you, Wayne. I completely agree. We'll put links in the bottom, and all of every time that you share your time with us and speak, there will be links to purchase the book, Fruits of Graft, and you should. You're exactly right. I mean, you should purchase a book for you, for your friends, your children. It should be required reading in America because this is a real history, documented history. It's not the created history or the narrative that was created to have you believe a lie or the untruth. Let
me just mention one thing in regard to the price thing. A reader sent me an email just within the past month from a website at Amazon, and it was my book was advertised there, a so-called new copy for $237 plus or something like that. I'm not sure. It was in right around that figure, and so there are resellers available. But go to my website, classicalcapital.com. It's the place to go.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, Wayne. Have a great day, and we'll
thank you,
talk
James.
next time.
All right.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on the Banking with Life podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe and click on that little notification bell. Otherwise, join us on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher for weekly content.